if you find it useless, it usually is going to be useless because you aren't going to find anything in the code because you don't believe this process works. Whereas someone like me, who is like a code review zealot, I'm looking at that code, anything that I'm slightly uncomfortable with, I'm going to stare at it till I figure out what's wrong here. And I tend to find a lot of things in code review, but the people who don't see the usefulness tend to find nothing. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where I'm going, this process, this works. And they're going, no, it doesn't.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Henry Kirk, and I am a partner at Studio Init, and I'm joined with Rob Moore and Randall Spence, who are also partners at our company. We're a development studio founded by a bunch of ex-Googlers, and I'm very proud to have with us today Erin Hamalainen, who is also an ex-Googler. We used to work together. And I caught up with her a few weeks ago, and it turns out she is authoring a book with a working title called Looks Good to Me. And it's all about code review and why it's very important. And so I thought it would be really great to bring Erin on here for a discussion so we can talk a little bit about not just like why code review is important, like as an engineer working for a company, but like oftentimes I'm always chatting with potential clients and folks that have had like a poor experience with other agencies and contractors. So I wanted to kind of have a discussion today about like why code review is so important, even when you're just kind of working on like MVPs and prototypes and getting from that like 0 to 1 phase, and working with contractors and other agencies and like making sure that there's like good code health in that thing. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Erin. Why don't you give us a little bit of introduction about like your book, what it's a little bit more about what you're going to talk about, and how you kind of came up with the idea for the book. We'd really love to hear it. And then we'll just have like a general conversation and see where it goes.
Okay. Thanks, Henry. So the book about code review, I guess the idea came from throughout my career, which is almost 11 years now, I think, of mostly iOS development. I've had a lot of different experiences with code review, some good and some bad. And after a while, I guess I started to have a lot of opinions on the topic. And some people thought they were interesting. So I wrote a few blog posts internally at the last place that I worked. And I ended up also giving a talk at our internal tech summit. It was called Why Code Review is a Skill Worth Investing in. And then I started publishing the blog posts externally and realizing that I just had a lot to say on the topic. And so I thought a book would be a great idea because I think code review is kind of a space in the software development lifecycle that is really not getting the attention it deserves as far as what software developers tend to talk about. We talk a lot about the coding phase of that lifecycle, and we talk a lot about testing and QA and like continuous integration, which I know that overlaps a bit with code review. And release testing and deployment, things like that. But the code review section, I think, doesn't get that much attention. So the idea of this book, my goal is to get more people talking about code review just by me starting the conversation and saying, like, here are the important points to address. Here are some different ways of doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And I hope that the conversation just goes from there.
That's awesome. So I think it's funny. Like having been at Google, like I've been through all of the code review madness, and I think that it's a very good thing. I used to actually pride myself by like trying to see just how many comments I can find in a code review. It turns out that not a lot of people like that. They find it kind of annoying when you nitpick at things, but it actually like helped me it helped me be a better engineer. But you were saying that your experience at Google was a little bit different, Erin, just before we started, right? Can you just
Yeah.
kind of start us off a little bit there?
Yeah. So I had a tech lead, I'm of course not going to name names, who just didn't see the value in code review. Just thought of it as more of a blocker, as something that slowed down the process. And a formality, I would say. He saw it as not something where you're adding value. So he tend to, and we worked on a team of just the two of us. So unfortunately, he had to do pretty much all of my code reviews and I had to do all of his. And this is not ideal because we had very different outlooks. So he pretty much rubber stamped all of my code review, which for me, there's two issues there. One, code review gives me, so especially at that point in my career, even now, really, I was very new. I had only been doing development for 3 years. And so I almost always had someone who was significantly more experienced reviewing my code. And that gave me a huge amount of confidence in what I was actually merging into the code base. When I didn't have this, it's a little scary because I knew that I'm not going to catch everything. I just did not, and still now, even after like a decade of doing this, I'm not going to catch everything, but I'm going to catch more than when I was 3 years into my career. But it's a little scary just on doing something on your own. It's like a surgeon doing a really complex surgery by their own. It's just not the ideal situation. So that was one issue, is I didn't have that much confidence in what I was merging into our code base. Number two is that I wasn't learning. Before that, I didn't realize just how much I had been learning through code review. And I am a person who likes to learn by doing, which I think is true of a lot of engineers, maybe a lot of people in general, but I'd much rather learn the architecture of the code base or the organization of the code base by giving someone a set of changes, making some mistake in there, and then saying, actually, we are using MVP, not, sorry, I don't want to use acronyms. We are using a model view.
MVC.
Yeah.
MVC or MVVM, right?
What's model view presenter, model view controller, model view view model, but
model view controller, and tell me like, we're not using this architecture, we're using that one, and you should use this file as an example, that sort of thing. It's so much easier to learn, for me, easier to learn that stuff through code review than to sit down and read a document of like, here's the style guide. This is how you should format if else statements and switch statements. It's hard for me to read that without falling asleep. It's hard for me to retain things that way. So what I prefer to learn that stuff through code review. And I still will read the important documents and look at the diagrams for the architecture, but it's better if I'm doing both really together. So yeah, that was so when my tech lead reviewed my stuff, it was just a rubber stamp. When I reviewed his stuff, I reviewed it very carefully. The place I'd worked previously had really been drilled into me that as the reviewer, you are just as responsible as the author for the code going in. You can't just be like, well, he wrote it, if something goes wrong. You're both like equally responsible. So I took code review very seriously because whatever gets through, I am to blame. And that's fine. Things are going to get through. And I am to blame for many mistakes. I'm human. That's expected. You can't work in a culture where you're punished for making mistakes. We're all trying our best. But there is some limit of reasonability. I can't just let everything through. I have to put in a good effort and continuously improve my skills. So I did read very carefully through his code changes and make the comments that I felt were appropriate. And to him, I think this came off as probably a bit of an attack if he is not used to this, and also as just slowing down the project. I think that was his main thing, is that he saw this as really destroying velocity. And because he really felt that I should just be rubber stamping his code review, like small formality type of thing. I'm sure this was also very destructive to his own morale. So it wasn't a great situation. And I think I didn't know about the code review guidelines at Google, as I was saying earlier, because he certainly, I don't know if he knew about them, but he certainly didn't care about them. And I never thought to look for any until maybe 2 or 3 years into my time there. But I do think if there were guidelines and they were something that our team and our manager referenced on a regular basis, like, oh yeah, remember, we do this way, or like smaller changes are better. That's the agreement of, that's the way we work here, and things like that. That would have been helpful to kind of eliminate the like me versus him. It would have just been like, look, this is the process here. Let's both follow it. And it would have, I think, removed a lot of the conflict and like the interpersonal conflict, basically.
So Randall, you've been at a bunch of companies in the past too. I know I've worked with Rob a long time. So like I have an idea of what his philosophy on code review is, and I'd love you to share it. But like Randall, like what's your opinion of like what can go wrong when you're not reviewing one another's code?
Oh yeah, I mean a lot of things can go wrong. So like I mean, the main reason why it's like especially important for like larger organizations like Google is the fact that like you just have so many users. So like any bugs are going to be noticed. Like even the smallest bugs are noticed by thousands or tens of thousands of people, right? That's if you're lucky. So that's the main thing, catching potential mistakes, but then also like your teammates, like especially if you're the newer person coming in, like they're gonna have a lot more context as to like the bigger picture of things. So like you might make a change that's like fine within just the area that you tested and you played with it and everything works, but like it could have some like downstream effect that you aren't aware of. So that's just one example.
Rob, what are some of the like implications you think of not having a proper code review process?
I think the biggest one is just hubris. So I think a lot of engineers come in, we view ourselves mostly as artisans. I think when we finish any formal education or some online tutorial, we're crafts people of code. And you use the term engineer. I think there's a distinct difference in the discipline. So the moment we introduce code review is the moment that we have to have some other professional with a similar background agree that what we're doing is a good idea, right? So if I were building a house and I would just nail in bunches of 2x4s together, it might stay up. It might come down the first stiff wind. But if I had someone else who knew what they were talking about review and say, maybe you should reinforce those corners, or maybe you should use better screws or nails, that's just going to help me build a better house. It's also going to teach me a lot. And I know a lot of people feel that code review only really becomes valuable at this larger scale of companies or products. But I personally think it's even more important when you have a smaller team. And the biggest reason is that you have a greater duplication of knowledge in the team. So if someone is out sick or someone gets laid off or decides to pursue other opportunities, you don't lose a lot of knowledge immediately. There's also less need to offboard, for example. Yeah.
That's true. Even at I was just going to jump in and say, even with our currently small operation, like Rob and I are working on different projects right now, but I'll still review what he's got going on. He reviews what I'm going on. One, to catch mistakes, like I was saying, but also like what Rob was saying, if he has to take a day off or he's out sick or I'm out sick or something, like he's aware of the context. It's, what was it called, Rob? Like bus insurance or something? Like if Rob gets hit by a bus, I can take over.
Acceptable term.
I've heard a new term for this called like the win the lottery phenomenon. If someone at the job wins the lottery and they just take off and leave.
Yeah, that's a much more
the IPO way, right?
The lottery, like the Mega Millions, when it hits $1 billion, I always buy a ticket just to imagine what I might do with $1 billion.
I mean, I've heard that if you win the lottery, you should keep your job, but
absolutely. So Rob, you hit on a really good point. I just want to kind of like bring up again, where it's you had said that like it's just as important to do code reviews on small scale than the big scale, because obviously the big scale has ramifications on millions of users. But the small scale thing I've found is like, okay, you can have really scrappy MVPs and put them out there and they work, right? And then there's the whole thing, which I want to talk about, is like you only really get to kind of impress that user once. And if you have a terrible, let's say, onboarding experience that's buggy, or it's just there's issues and glitches as they go along while using the product, you really don't have a second chance that you can win them back, right? But then folks say, well, hey, you should expect it to be beta. We put beta on it, blah, 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 right? But there's still that kind of that level of quality that you need to deliver on that even just a QA cycle or something like that cannot always catch, right? So how can like the code review be leveraged at those smaller scales? Like what is the, like maybe Erin, what's your opinion on this, or guys, like what is the minimum amount of like code review oversight that you're looking for to kind of not take forever, like you had said earlier, Erin, like blocking your TL thought they were slowing down the process, but then lead to enough quality so that way you can then not have to redo things and start all over again, right?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this, so many. But one thing is that the process is definitely a series of trade-offs. Like there's no ideal, like we just can't have it all. And I think so I'm planning to write a lot about this in my book, because I really just want to like spoon feed solutions to people, even though that's not necessarily possible because every product is different and the company is different. But so Randall was mentioning about having context and distributing knowledge, and that's like a huge thing. And that's one of the things that you often trade off. So in my most recent company that I was working for, we had about 25 iOS developers when I joined, and we were split into 5 different teams. So usually when you're getting a code review, it's from someone on your 5-person team because you're working on the same feature or mission. They already have the context. So that saves a whole bunch of time up front. They can jump into the code review. They're probably familiar with the code. They're definitely familiar with the domain. But it's also really valuable to have someone without that context look at that code to ask those questions that maybe we've forgotten, and we're all making the same assumptions at this point. And maybe they're going to say like, oh, but is that what the product team meant by a French user? Is it somebody in France, or is it somebody with their phone's locale set to France? And you might be like, we've been implementing this all wrong. So I think, kind of you're going to get the best review from someone who does not have context, because they will be asking those questions, but that review is going to take them longer. So like that's a trade-off. And then there are some trade-offs, like in general, you're going to be looking at, not in general, but sometimes you're looking at view layout code, like code that is just for the UI. And maybe that's not a good use of code review time, because visual issues could be very quickly caught in QA and not as quickly caught from looking at the code. So like maybe that's a place where you don't need to spend so much time, because an issue that would be visible to the user could be quickly caught by QA. Just let them look at it. Don't bother looking at it unless there is an actual problem. Like these are just kind of example trade-offs that you might make in certain scenarios. But it really has to be tailored. Sorry, Rob, go ahead. Jump in.
I don't have a raise hand feature. I was raising my actual hand. I want to make a counterpoint to the idea. I've done a lot of UI code and a lot of UI code reviews, and the most common way I do code review for UI, or if it has an impact on UI, is to grab the change and build it and run it locally and play with it. I think Randall can attest to this, that my primary device is not his primary device when I'm testing or layout. And I can sometimes I'll immediately find a bug on my side that he didn't see, even when he ran a few different, test devices. I think nitpicking over whether this constraint is done first or this calculation is stored in a local variable, I don't think that's really valuable, but I expect my code reviews to be as functional as possible. So if it's deep in the bowels of some function and I can't really reproduce it, easily, maybe that's an issue with the architecture is not testable, but I might just go through the code logic. But if it's something like, here's the new, as Henry pointed out, first-time user experience, I'm going to fire it up, get a new account, and see how it plays. I would expect that to be part of code review. But that's not always the case.
Yeah, I generally always do some amount of QA as part of my code review. And there's so many different ways, like different shops have, will have a QA person embedded in the team, or it's just up to the developers to do it, or they have a whole separate division. But that was just kind of like an example of a trade-off. I'm not necessarily endorsing. It's not my personal style, but I try not. I don't want to be prescriptive, because maybe there is a scenario where that would be the best use of everyone's time. But in general, I debate this in my head. Like when I have a whole series of steps of like what I do first in code review, personal process, but I always do run the code. And I know not everyone does that. And maybe there are scenarios where it's not necessary. I'm not sure. I don't have a great example of one, but I'm open to the idea that maybe sometimes code review would just be looking at the code and not running it. But for my personal process, I will always at least go through what I would call the happy path and make sure it works, because my view is, well, if the happy path doesn't work, I know the code is going to change. So there's not really a point in me reviewing this right now, because it's going to change. It might be completely removed. I think back to Henry's original question was about code review taking a long time, and trade-offs. Yes. So the other thing I was thinking is, some people are not convinced of the usefulness of code review. And I think healthy skepticism is a great thing. And I think that organizations should probably be making sure their code review process is actually effective, is finding issues before they get to is finding issues and solving them in the least expensive way, which usually means finding them as soon as possible in the process. But there is this phenomenon with code review where if you find it useless, it usually is going to be useless, because you aren't going to find anything in the code because you don't believe this process works. Whereas someone like me, who is like a code review zealot, I'm looking at that code, anything that I'm slightly uncomfortable with, I'm going to stare at it till I figure out what's wrong here. And I tend to find a lot of things in code review, but the people who don't see the usefulness tend to find nothing. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where I'm going, this process, this works. And they're going, no, it doesn't. So that's definitely one of the hard parts of convincing people that it is a worthwhile use of time, or use of some amount of time.
Yeah, I think part of the, I wanted to say, I think part of the challenge there is that, as I think you mentioned earlier, or maybe in the pre-show, but a lot of times code review and this type of stuff isn't rewarded during performance reviews. And so there's no connection between my doing a code review and my getting money. And for people who don't inherently see value in doing code review, the company culture has to tie that action to their money. Because if I code review for you, Erin, and your project is a success and you get more money from your bonus, that's your incentive, right, to get a good code review. But where was mine, right? So I think
I
one way
absolutely
to
agree. Like, the incentives are often not there.
So what about?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say
Sorry.
one way I've seen this implemented in a simple way is if you look at the distribution of work within a team members, and you can often see how many commits they've done, how many code reviews they've done, how many issues they've filed or resolved. And these are all, fairly easy metrics to track in most systems. And you could just say, listen, we expect everyone to have a healthy balance, right? And if someone like Erin gets to choose her reviewers and sends them to people who are going to give her better reviews, then the people who are rubber stamping aren't going to get their numbers. And then the team can have a conversation, hopefully. But you also say, hey, listen, Erin launched a great product. I see Randall and Henry, you both were, the top 4 code reviewers, and it was a great product. So we're going to give you, an equivalent of 10% of Erin's bonus on the project or something, for your contributions. These type of things can happen. They can be inexpensive, relatively speaking, but it helps. And then I think once you start doing good code reviews, you can start to see the value of it in it.
Yeah,
1000%. I just want to jump in and just like reinforce this point here, because it's like, so we took on a client many months ago, and we were going to be coming in and building additional features on top of the existing platform that was built. And so during our kind of diligence phase that we do, we took a look at the code, we took a look at what what they wanted to be built, and like what we needed to do. And it turns out that the platform that the prior company had built for them was completely hacked together and a bunch of spaghetti code. In fact, what I thought was hilarious was lead engineer, VP of engineering, whatever, at this decent sized, agency. And of course they offshore stuff was, we know this is kind of fragile, but we saw this as like a MVP kind of thing was what they were getting at. But now what ended up happening is this company had to spend all their money over again. We had to change the scope of the project and start from scratch because we could not, A, make sense of what was there. B, there was no, like the logic made, like there was nothing that we could save from it. And the architecture, since that wasn't reviewed, was a complete disaster. So we had to start all over again. And so like not having the right oversight of these things can cause so much more problems, but folks don't realize, they think that you need to get this, like, I need to hack this and get it out the door. So like, I'm a big fan of Levels.io. And like the other day he said something when he upgraded his version of PHP, which, like, it is just funny that he uses it, right? Because all the modern, like, other languages are out there. But he said that like, it's, preventing him from being the like cowboy engineer or something like that, meaning that he just like goes and gets it done. But he's a one-man show, and he's responsible for his own product. So like, I think that that's fine. I have my own side projects where I hold myself accountable. If it breaks or it's buggy or users don't use it, that's my fault. Like, I have all the accountability on me. But when you're working for other people's projects, like, and you are producing like not good enough work, then like you're going to cause problems down the line. So it's going to cost other people money, but you already got paid. What do you care, right, Rob?
I mean, I want to weigh in on that because I think a risk of going that way is that if you keep doing your own projects one way, then when you take on client work, your brain is automatically going to think that way. So one way to really improve, I found code quality, is to hire a duck. Get yourself a rubber ducky, put it on your desk or wherever you like to work, and as silly as it sounds, literally speak out loud to the duck and explain the code as if you were speaking to a colleague. Okay, speaking to an empty room, it's fine. But the moment you have to start teaching someone and explaining to someone what you're doing and why you're doing it, I'd say about 20% of the time you'll realize, oh, I should make a comment here, or that was a bug. Let me fix that. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Randall and I've just started to talk about my code and I'm like, hold on, Randall, never mind, I found the bug.
Right, I figured it out as I was saying it. Yep, happens all the time.
But a 99-cent rubber duck is a great
osmosis. Randall figured it out for you.
It's a very inexpensive employee, right? And it's a great sounding board. So I would be very cautious in ever recommending that someone can skip code reviews, even if they're just working on their own. Personally, when I push up a PR or a change, the first thing I do is I preview it and I code review it myself. And I literally add comments at times. Like I might, if I'm embarrassed, I might draft them and then delete them, but I do add comments. And then when I go back and make the changes and then I push it up and then I ask a colleague to take a look. But I think that's an important habit.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of reviewing your own code first. I think we mentioned a lot about working alone, and I find this to be such an interesting topic. And I mean, really working alone, not like Rob and Randall, like you are working on separate things, but you work at the same studio. So could code review for each other. But for people who are truly working alone, what do they do about code review? Because that you're really at a disadvantage. Because
I did this recently. So we took on a client, and I was the only person on the project. So I met Henry. Henry managed some of the sales stuff, but I took on the engineering, and I met with them weekly. And their code was a challenge. We were adjusting their code and updating it and bringing it to the cloud. And their code was a challenge to work with because it was for example, the UI and the business logic were very tightly coupled. And so there was no one else who knew the language of the company. It was C++. I was the only one. And no one else was on the project. I was the only asset. So what I did is I did my own code reviews. So not only did I look at my GitHub PRs and draft form and review them, and then once they're posted, I would review them. But the other thing I did is I started adding tests. And the tests were very poor. I will admit they were not good tests because all they did was capture the behavior. They were just change detection tests. Yeah. And this is because we were making changes to the code, but we didn't want to change the business logic. So I wrote tests that tried to capture as much behavior as I could, and then I would make a change. And if the test changed, I would go and say, okay, was that an intentional change? Did I want that to happen? Or was that a mistake? Or was it an edge case I failed to catch earlier? So I think that's one area where code review can't really help you as much as other parts of QA, like testing, like designing, but when you're alone, you're really at a disadvantage, I think.
Yeah. I've been asking a lot of people, what do you, I mean, I was joking to my one friend that I'm going to have a chapter in my book, like what to do when you work alone. And I'm just going to say, don't, because I just didn't know what to say. But a friend of mine said that he knew someone who used to work by himself, and he would actually pay someone, kind of contract somebody out over the internet, some random person to review. Yeah, I had never heard of that before. So I thought that was really interesting. And I need to still get in touch with that guy and ask him about that. And did it work for him? What were the ups and downs? But the thing I'm super excited that I've started reading about are all these AI tools that can do code review. And I'm sure I'm getting way too excited and ahead of myself. I haven't tried them out yet, but I have a list. I know I need to try them out. I'm ashamed that I haven't yet, but I'm really excited for that. Not that it replaces peer code review because, well, for many reasons, but at this point, there's still false positives and false negatives, and you do have to have someone go through and check that the tool, is catching things correctly and stuff. But I am so optimistic that this could automate a lot of the toil involved in code review, that we don't have to worry about simpler errors or even more complicated. One of the things I think code review is useful, like Rob was saying, you can write a lot of tests to capture and save you from making a lot of mistakes. But right now, I am not aware of tests that will say hey, you're not following the architecture here. But artificial intelligence is supposed to be really good at recognizing patterns that are super complex even. So I'm extremely excited that AI code review tools would be able to catch that automatically, and you wouldn't need a human reviewer necessarily to notice those kinds of like violations of higher level patterns in the code.
I mean, I
cool.
totally agree. I think I personally use a very popular coding assistant right now in VS Code when I develop, and while it's good for the business logic code, it's been phenomenal for writing tests. So, and in terms of architecture, one thing I've found well is that if, at least for me, if you make your code more modular and more testable, it's a lot harder to break your architectural decisions. So if you want to follow MVC, Model View Controller, for example, then if you have a model that is just its own thing, you can write some very simple tests on whatever functions it has. If you have a view that just presents a model, then you could write a snapshot UI test that just captures how it looks with different inputs. And if you have a controller that then decides how these things fit together or handles different flows or functions in logic, you could test those as well. You could unit test those or integration test those. And as long as you ensure that you can test your code, I think it often helps you keep yourself stuck to the architectural decision. So if you have adapters or if you have builders or factories or whatever these patterns people like to do, I think as long as you can test those things, whether you do or not, as long as you can test them, it really helps. And that's where AI today can still help you a lot, is if you say, oh, write a test for this. If you can't write the test for it, or it can't figure out how to write the test for it, you've probably broken your own architecture, and because it needs that pattern of the existing architecture in your code to suggest how to do it the next time, right? So I think we're making good progress. But yeah, when you encounter novel situations or, I was using object oriented, but this library is completely functional. How do I massage that into my pattern? Yeah, that's where human intelligence is really still required.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm slightly worried about with using more AI, and just, I mean, I love automation in general, but I know I'm totally guilty of, if there is a tool or some tests, then I'm like, it's good. I become overconfident in the abilities of those tools. Like at the last place I worked, they were following this shift left movement, which is all about moving your testing left in the software development life cycle. So it could mean moving QA into code review, or moving unit testing into the code writing, whatever it means for your organization. It's just a general idea of like putting testing earlier in the process. But in this particular organization, they weren't having dedicated QA roles. Like developers were responsible for QAing their work, not necessarily their own. I mean, obviously it's hard not to QA your own work as you are developing it. You're generally running the code. But someone else would need to QA it in order for it to be merged. And this made me a much better engineer, to be honest, because I took so much more ownership of the quality of what I was creating, rather than just being super focused on the code quality. I became a lot more focused on the product quality as a whole, and just took a lot more ownership. So it ended up, for me, making me a better engineer to not have QA to lean on. But I still want to lean on AI for code review.
Okay, so this is really interesting. Like, we've been talking for a long time about why code review is great, and we all are big proponents of it. But I'm sure there was a point in our careers where we didn't really believe in it. We thought it slowed us down, and it bit us in the butt. So I have a funny story about that. But like, does anyone have any other stories? Like, Randall, you've been in that situation, or something you want to share?
Yeah.
Because clearly there has to have been that moment when we figured out, like, oh boy, okay, this really is important. So what's yours, Randall?
Yeah, so I can kind of give a few. So the thing that mainly comes to mind was coming to Google. So Google has a culture of small CLs. So CLs is Google's equivalent of like a pull request for the viewers. But so most companies don't have this concept, actually. Most companies, and so I've worked at a lot of them, Wayfair, Apple, Amazon, like those don't have this culture. Maybe other companies do. But so most companies have a culture of like feature branches. So that's where you code out, like, let's say you're developing a new feature that lets users like, you know, preview an item before they buy it or something, right? Like you would just develop this feature, like maybe you or one or two teammates in isolation on a branch, keep the branch updated with main, and like no one else is ever seeing it really until the whole feature is done and it's like 3,000, 4,000 lines of code. And then you pull request into the main branch, right? So, I have been in the industry for a while. I'm thinking, yeah, this is just the way everyone does it. It's such a good idea. And then, like, I started working with Rob at Google, and he's like,
This is the story I wanted to. This is exactly what I wanted you to bring up.
I mean, yeah, he's basically like, well, what is this crap? What are you doing? So, like, Google has all this documentation of like why, like, you should do small CLs, for example. But it's like it's really difficult to make that shift because, like, and it's interesting because, like, even though you are kind of making small changes into your feature branch, they are sort of like disjointed. So, like, you might like fix like one small part of the feature on this side and like a different part of it over here, and then merge that all at once, right? So, like, even like your logic isn't like fully compartmentalized. So just like eventually you get to the point where you're just doing the smallest logical chunk at once, but like it takes like it's a huge mental shift. So just even that, like having a review there of like the biggest example is like I would always just like be cleaning up like random parts of the code as I like go through it and see it. Like maybe something doesn't fit the style guide, or maybe there's like a typo or something. And it's like it could be in like a file that I was just looking at because it like had an example of what I'm trying to do, but it's like completely unrelated to my feature. And it's like you're merging in this change like from some file that like is like 3 years old or something, right? And it's like it has nothing to do with what you're working on. So just even like breaking that up and like sure you make that change, but merge that one line change and then do whatever else you're doing here, like it makes a lot of things way easier. Like, for example, let's say your feature goes in and there's a bug, like when you go back and are like splitting the commits, like, oh, the bug is in this commit that's 3,000 lines, or oh, the bug is in this commit that's 4 lines. It's like, even if I just close my eyes and point at a line, I have a 25% chance of figuring out what's wrong with it, right? So just even from that standpoint, it's like way better. But definitely for the people that don't do it that way, it's like a kind of a painful process to unlearn that.
Yeah, and also, especially at organizations where you have owners of code that are outside your team and you need to make a change, and then they ask you 10 million questions and they're really holding you up for like 2 weeks because they want to have an architectural review. I mean, this is the difference of like companies moving, like accepting reasonable changes and moving on versus those that just like, I don't even know what the psychology behind that is. Like,
well, Henry,
whatever, but like, yeah.
I recall a situation at Google. We were working with Gmail. And as an iOS developer, I was used to using Objective-C, Swift, and stuff, but Gmail's written with a lot of interoperability with other languages, including C and C++. So it was a big, there's a lot of generated code as well. So there's a lot of challenge in how do I do a thing, right? There's no documentation. You had to be on the team, but we were an external group working on their code base. How do you do a thing? One thing that really saved us, though, is small changes. And Google requires this because Google has continuous integration, continuous deployment. Your change goes live to prod. There's no like compiler level flags allowed in most situations. So you have to make sure that your change is compatible with whatever's happening now. And that's great. But these small CLs and these external reviewers, I put something up. It was 100, 150 lines. I thought it was how I could get a flag. I wanted a flag at runtime to turn my thing on or off, first change. They're like, that's not how you do a flag. You do this flag this other way. And I was like, I had no idea. But now I knew. And I could go and rant to Randall and say, oh my goodness, can you believe that this team, the blah, blah, blah. But now you know, here's how you do flags in this other code base. So, I mean, I will say I have always been a proponent of code review. Unfortunately, I never got to be baptized in the font of pain that you guys went through. But it is super helpful to not have to rewind 6 weeks of work because I made a mistake at the very beginnings of my assumptions. I will say I will credit one of my first computer science professors, Dr. Marco T. Morazan at Seton Hall University. Our programming exams for our first semester of programming were in Blue Books. We had to write the code in Blue Books, syntactically correct. It had to solve the problem. And then we had to provide mathematical proofs that our function would do the thing that it had to do. So if we were implementing, let's say in a graph, you were just trying to find a depth first search, do a depth first search on a binary tree or a graph, you had to prove it. You had an hour and a half. You had to write down a mathematical proof of why your code worked. And so, at least for me, that level of rigor has really stayed with me because I look at my code and I figure out how could I prove that my code works to myself. And that's what code review is. I think its foundation is that you're trying to get someone else to believe that your code does what you think it does and does it correctly. So whether you have to explain it to them or they read it, see it on their own, or they want more comments for posterity, I think that's what it comes down to. Like you have to convince someone else that your code is achieving the goal it's supposed to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Yeah. Achieving the goal, right? And I think you get organizations that take it too seriously, and then it becomes a grind. And then it's like you get burned out, and then you go slow, and then everything's just terrible. Like I can't tell you how many times. So I was, those of you that are watching, like I was an engineering manager for many years, and folks on my team would come to me and say, "This change is stuck. Can you help me?" And I would have to go and reach out to the manager and say, "What's going on?" Right? And it would be simple things. These are logical changes, but they can be held up at all different levels. Versus where it's useful is what Rob is talking about, is convincing that other person or yourself that this is a sound change that will not cause bugs, cause issues, and all that stuff. That's why I think Erin, your book is going to be wildly successful. And because this is super essential, especially you also nailed it that not every team has QA anymore. And it's okay to not have QA. Engineers become lazy when they're relying on QA. And then there's all these tools, just like you said, they're not perfect. So you can't rely on the tool. So how do you do it? It's you can go really, really fast, but you just have to take a moment and just take a look at what you have, and it makes you better. So it's just
my ideal is to use these tools, but for no one to ever tell me how good they are. Just tell me that they are completely unreliable. That way I'm using them, but I'm never getting lazy about it. But I think what both Henry, you and Rob have and actually Randall have all alluded to is that I think Google's process, code review process, is really good at training you to make small changes because of the whole, if you break the build, your change is just immediately automatically rolled back. And that really taught me not to couple things together that are not related, because I saw some people really create some difficult issues for themselves with some crazy putting things together that shouldn't be together, or even separating tests and implementation, and then roll back the tests or one of the two, but then everything is broken. And it just really taught me that to plan for when everything goes wrong, because when everything goes right, it doesn't matter anyway, but when everything goes wrong, your life is going to be so much easier if you haven't added anything extra into that change. No cleanup in other files and stuff, as much as I'm always tempted to do it. To which I will say, I know that at some places the issue that people will stick things into change lists or pull requests that aren't really related to that specific pull request. And usually the reasoning is that their cycle to get something reviewed and QA'd if it's separate and then merged is such a long feedback loop, basically. So people are trying to stick things in left and right. And I think it still ends up costing you more time in the long term. And that basically the solution isn't to stick more things in. The solution is to improve your continuous integration or your tests so that they don't take so long to run. And things like that, I think, should be first priority rather than compromising your code review process. At least I think that's my opinion. Open to different views.
Yeah, well, another thing is like, because I've definitely been in some like, strenuous, and very slow, like review feedback loops and that type of thing. But like, it is a little counterintuitive because you're like, oh, well, if I were to split this thing into 5, like, then I have 5 things that need to be reviewed. So that's going to be really slow, potentially 5 times as slow.
5 times as long.
But it's actually like not, because like if you have this one change, it's just like, fix the spacing, like fix a typo. Then like whoever's reviewing is going to look at it and be like, oh yeah, that was spelled wrong. Boom, like you're good. And there's not going to be anything. So then by the time they get to your logic change, that's, only 5 lines instead of 20 lines, then, like I can just see this logic. Yeah, that should work. Or they can immediately get to their question of what happens in this case. And then you have to be like, oh crap, I didn't consider that, or yeah, it's fine, or whatever.
I think a lot of times I've seen this even with smaller changes. You try to get one unit of work into one change. So it might be a ticket or a bullet within a story. And so it might be, say, get the subscription ID, right? So like implement getting the subscription ID for a user. So you might have the public interface change. You have the internal business logic checking, the authentication check, the database pull, and then the tests for everything, right? So this might be a small thing. It's like one query into a database with a fast lookup and one response. And you might think to put this into a small change and I'll review it. But then someone says, well, what about this edge case on the auth side? What about this case in the business logic? What about if the database changes? What about this test? So the challenge can be like, if everything's together, then there's this one thing that someone's nitpicking about or has a valid concern about, and it holds up everything. And all your other stuff is held up as well. But if you can separate the database interface, you can separate the business logic, separate the front interface, then if those aren't contentious, merge them, put in stubs for now to make them work, and then move on. And then you can just really narrow down, like, what is the thing that's slowing me down? And at the same time, you can work through that. But at the same time, you can work on other stuff around, the parts that are already merged.
So what if you are blocked though? Like you mentioned this a couple times.
So
how do you get past those that are really that like the code owner or your reviewer is just not giving up?
So I think the biggest problem I've seen in code review culture is democracy. Democracy does not work on development teams in general, and it does not work in code reviews. You need to have an authority. There has to be a dictator who says, this is the style guide we adopt. This is the syntax linter that we use. This is it. And
right.
Everything,
Be a tiebreaker sometimes.
And ideally that would then turn into both documentation for the team and an automatic checker, if possible. And that way, because I think I told this to Randall a lot of times when we were discussing code, I said, Randall, we get paid to follow the style guide that was handed down from us on high. We're not volunteers. This isn't charity. They don't have to take our code or leave it. Like, we get paid. So if they say that lines in with a semicolon or don't, that's what we do, right? And so on any given team, if there's a disagreement in style or approach, have a discussion as a team, but then the dictator decides what it's going to be. Maybe leave it open. Say, listen, we'll revisit in 6 months and see how things panned out, and then move forward, right? Accept that some of these things are just going to be the constraints of your job. I worked at Burger King as my first job, and I didn't get to choose when I took my break. My manager did. Sometimes it was 6 hours in, sometimes it was 2 hours in. It depended on what the company needed, right? So I think the same thing happens with these software jobs. But again, we're artisans with hubris coming into it, and we have to learn that at some point we don't get to make all of our own decisions.
Yeah, I think it's like a huge part of working on a team is letting go of the way you wanted to implement that feature. Like it's sometimes you have to do it how the other person wanted it. I still definitely struggle with this. But I think I do like when people challenge my opinion, because it forces me to write out like, okay, Erin, exactly why is this way better? And no, a valid answer is not because it was the first thing that popped into your head or because you've done it this way before, because that's the way you're familiar with. Like, can you articulate, are there actual benefits to your way over this other way? So it's always a learning experience for me. But I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna say that I'm the best, the most gracious, like relinquishing control sometimes.
I don't think any of us are. I mean, Henry pointed out that he used to essentially try and score the highest number of comments on a CL or a change that he could. I
actually love that. But like, I want people to find everything they can wrong. And I always love people who approach QA as like, I am going to break this. Like, it's not a matter of will I will figure out a way. Like, but that's me. And I know that's not a realistic way to run an entire
I feel that that's a very healthy attitude for your own code. If you go into your own review of the way you write code and say, how many ways can someone break this or destroy it? Or you can write defensively, you can document defensively, you can find this. I think one challenge that comes up, and I'm guilty of this. I have a mug that I got at Audible from a coworker, and it was a fake version of our Garrett. This is like 50 snapshots, 1957 comments. So at the time, it was an exaggeration of how hard I code reviewed my teammates. Later, I actually surpassed it in reality, and but I keep this as a reminder that this is not a positive experience for people.
I think I started that culture there. That's my fault.
But the way I view it now is not, is this code that I would merge? I'm an owner. So as a code reviewer, I feel that I'm an owner and author. Not necessarily, is this code that I would merge? But is there anything that I think would embarrass me or the company if this code went through? Right? Is there a glaring error in logic or a comment that really shouldn't be there, or a log statement that contains inappropriate, data? It could be PII, like personally identifiable information, or it could just be a frustrating comment or something. At that level, besides any mandatory requirements, I think that's the level of ownership you can reasonably take. And so if Randall wants to call, number.abs, and I prefer to use the global function abs and pass in a number, I mean, at the end of the day, that's personal preference, and I just let it go. But again, unless you can point out a technical reason, right?
Right, exactly. That's why I love finding those, like, in the reviews, like you put something up and then someone's like, oh, well, technically, this method is faster or whatever. Like, you learn a lot from your teammates just because, like, someone happened to read some article that's like about what you're doing right then. So it's really good piggyback as well. Like, you learn a lot just doing these reviews from whoever you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like my experience on where I ended up trying to give a ton of comments is when I came into my first professional software engineering career, that was at Amazon and Audible. I noticed that I cared a ton about user interface. Like, that was my thing. That was what I was really an expert at. So when I was nitpicking at things, it wasn't always just like business logic. It was always how the UI was designed, because I was trying to get everyone in a mindset where they were thinking about the ramifications of their change and how it may not scale. Because you're always building features and it always requires UI. And the biggest thing that always annoyed me was refactoring to then add that new feature. So it was like a big push. So my comments were all with that, and people used to hate me for that. It wasn't, I didn't necessarily care about like an implementation detail of like certain things. It was always like, why did you choose to lay it out this way? Why are the constraints like put on this way? Especially as like Rob and I know, like there was not every company cares about accessibility and other things like that. And so dynamic type, which is like, adjusting the font size to different screen settings and whatnot, like is very important to a certain class of users. And if you don't have a strong culture of paying attention to how that then works, it's like, very, very important. So I used to, people used to hate me for that, and I would do tons of comments on there. And I learned that you really need to ease people into that. Just like advice, like if you're going to do 100, like start with 20 and then get them through those 20 and then add in another 20. If you do all 100 at once, they usually start to hate you right from day one. So, and it's kind of hard to recover there. But anyway, so we are way over time, and we should probably start wrapping this up a little bit, because like hopefully folks other than our parents are still watching at this point. But this has been a really great conversation. So I don't know.
Erin, thank you so much for having me. Like, I got so much out of this. I wrote a zillion notes that, I'm going to fold back into the book. And like, I just love talking about this stuff, and forces me to think more and everything like that. So yeah, I thought this was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I also I feel like I could keep going for hours, but
we probably could.
That's why I'm writing a book.
This is great, Erin. So Rob, anything that, or Randall, Rob.
Well, I think one thing before we go is, I think code review is an excellent part of a quality assurance framework during software development. This idea of shift left disturbs me, because it implies people are already waterfalling or still waterfalling in 2023. But one thing I think that's important is that I view code review as a tactical tool, meaning it's done in the moment, it's done at the point when the code is committed. But as a part of a larger QA framework, things like architecture review and design documents and design document review are critical, because, as you pointed out, Erin, right now we need humans to detect deviations from architectural choices. But if you don't have an architectural choice, then you can very easily have wildly deviating parts of your code that over time cannot be refactored and maintained. So I always view design docs and design reviews and architecture reviews as like that strategic approach of like, how are we going to tackle the problem? And then code reviews are, how did we actually implement the solution along the way? So hopefully you can talk a little bit about the, where it fits into the broader scope of reviews in software. But,
so I'm so happy you brought that up. I know we're closing up, but mentioning that like there's so many more things to review than just code. I thought about addressing all of it, and then I was like, no, I can't fit it. But yeah, it's definitely it's such an interesting conversation.
Cool. Randall, any closing thoughts?
I think my closing thoughts are like, if people aren't doing code reviews, I think that's honestly crazy. Even if you're alone, you should do it. Get an AI to do it. AI tools are free. But also like, probably using an AI like as a junior, I don't know if that would be the best if you don't necessarily know what you're doing, because hallucinations are a thing. You should definitely learn how to add before you pick up a calculator. But yeah.
That's great. Cool. All right. So again, Erin, thank you so much for joining us. This has been like an awesome conversation. So your book is, the current working title is Looks Good to Me, right? And when do you kind of expect to maybe have a published perhaps?
So my goal is to have an official publication date set before the end of 2024, as in the book I want ideally published in 2024. But it's my first rodeo, so I don't know if that's realistic. I'm totally new to the process. But yeah, that's the goal, that it would be out next year, or at least have an official date set before the end of the year.
Cool.
And,
Okay. Well, what we'll do. Oh, sorry, Rob.
Erin, are you going to be the narrator for the official audiobook as well?
I was thinking about that because I know audiobooks are so popular, and I don't want there to be any bar to access for anyone, because really I just want as much feedback as possible. I mean, I'm trying to get as
Definitely
much
narrate it.
feedback
Yeah.
before I publish.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Maybe we can have you on after you go through this process to like talk about others, even though, I mean, yeah, we talk about all kinds of like product development, and I think developing a book is very similar. So yeah, probably have you back on too. Or what we'll do, even better, is like we'll put your contact info in the description of this video. So if anyone wants to have you on as a speaker or can help you out with this or has some good advice.
Yeah, or if they have strong, especially the people that like strongly disagree with anything I've said, those are the people I want to hear from the most, you know?
Yeah. And those folks of you, like, go in the comments, because that helps with our engagement and we'll get much better views out of this, which we could use. So thank you. Yeah, please come and tell us why we're wrong and we're thinking wrong. That would be great.
But yeah, you wouldn't believe how overloaded the term review is when you are writing a book about review and having people review it for you. And it's out of out of control at this point.
Well, this is awesome. So Erin, thanks again for joining us. And you've been listening to I don't even know if this is a podcast, whatever, a conversation with the folks at Studio Init. So Erin, good luck with your book. We'll keep in touch. And Rob, Randall, thanks for helping out with this today. Appreciate it. And until next time, folks, have a great rest of your week. Thanks.